Alrighty, so let's pick up today with yesterday we left off with the the great insult of the Delome letter. Today, let's talk about the actual events that push us into the war with Spain. So, if you remember, we had talked briefly about the fact that in a growing concern for American businesses and people in Cuba, President McKinley in late January had sent the USS Maine, one of the battleships of America's fleet, down to the main port of Cuba at Havana Harbor. So let's look real quick. Okay, so Havana, the capital of Cuba, is on the north side of the island here. Okay, so here's Florida, here's Havana. I mean, this is literally, it's a shorter distance from Havana to Florida than it is from like us to Chicago. All right. So the USS Maine is sent down to Havana to keep an eye on things. Early on the morning of February 15th, 1 week after the horrid insult of the Delome letter, the peaceful silence is shattered by look at this epic picture, okay? So, primary source document from yellow journals of the time. So, what do you have here? You have the USS Maine exploding. Notice the people flying in the air. You can see the bodies. You can see the water reflecting either the fire or the blood of the men who have been killed. You see people screaming in agony down here. Like, "Oh, boosh, boosh, bah, 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 bah." The boat falling apart. The U.S. Navy flag falling in a metaphor for what's going on. The horror, the carnage, the fire silhouetted by the dark black, indicating that something was done nefariously under the cover of darkness. And the back of the boat that looks like a Mississippi River barge, while the front of it looks like a supermodel battleship. Not really quite sure what to make of it, other than the fact that it's just pretty weird. But in any case, the Maine blows up. Okay. And this is a great example of a propaganda piece here. This is one of the full color pictures from the yellow journals of the time. Nobody really knew what happened, but that didn't stop the press from jumping to conclusions. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion was not an accident. Journal offers $50,000 reward for the conviction of criminals who sent 258 American sailors to their death. Naval officers unanimous that the ship was destroyed on purpose. Naval officers think the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. Hidden mine or sunken torpedo believed to have been the weapon used. Spanish officials protest too much. Officers and men tell stories of being blown into the air and amid a mass shatter steel and exploding shells. It's very obvious that the papers blame Spain, and they want answers, and they want McKinley to do something to get those answers. Now, the issue with the Maine is a very complicated one, and we'll get to that in a second. But in any case, there is no doubt that the Maine blew up, and that most people blame the Spanish. Spain knew what was going on. That's why they immediately declare a ceasefire unilaterally. That means that they didn't even bother to talk to the rebels. They just, nope, we're done fighting. War is over. That was a bad thing. We're not going to do that anymore in those concentration camps. We were just kidding. Those go away too. Now, in Washington, there is also mixed reaction. Nobody's really quite sure what to make of it. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, however, is very determined. Now, Theodore Roosevelt is a really interesting dude, and we're going to talk more about him next unit. He does become the 26th president of the United States following William McKinley. Before becoming Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so just to be very clear, the Secretary of the Navy is the person who is in charge of the entirety of the Department of the Navy. The Assistant Secretary is like his vice president. Just keep in mind how much power the vice president really has. So, Roosevelt was a really interesting guy. Before becoming the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was the police commissioner of New York City. Now, how you jump from the police chief of New York City to like Assistant Secretary of the Navy? Well, there's two factors in this. One is that Roosevelt was a huge devotee, disciple, if you will, Padawan even, of Alfred Mahan, the guy who wrote the book on the relationship between navies and the greatness of empires. Roosevelt himself wrote a book, A Naval History of the War of 1812. So he had a lot of Navy cred because of this. This is how he ended up with this job. Roosevelt was also a guy who believed that war was not only like necessary, it was good. Because according to Roosevelt's idea, and he has this theory that war is what helped make America great. American exceptionalism is in part based on the fact that every generation of America had a war. America's initial generation had the Revolution, obviously. That's followed up by the War of 1812. That's followed up by the Mexican War. That's followed up by the Civil War. This current generation has no war, and we need one. War would get us stuff we need. We need bases in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. War would do that because Spain's got those bases. We need purpose again in life, and we need to become an even greater nation. Greater in terms of not like we're already a great nation. We already proved to everybody that culturally we're the equal of anybody, if not superior, with our amazing World's Fair. We have inventions and entrepreneurship out the wazoo. What we need now is to show everybody that we can kick butt like every other great nation can. This is Roosevelt's idea. 10 days after the Maine explodes, on his own, without any permission from the actual Secretary of the Navy or the President, Roosevelt contacts Congress and asks them to double the size of the Navy. He then asks Congress to send ammunition and fuel to the Atlantic and Pacific naval fleets to prepare for war. And he orders the U.S. Pacific Fleet to get ready to attack the Philippines. Why? Well, because we needed bases in the Pacific, and the Philippines are in the Pacific, and Spain controls them. So if we're going to fight Spain in the Caribbean, let's fight them in the Pacific too. This is a continued growing alarming trend for wars between countries to become much more than localized events, but to become like world events. Now, the interesting thing about this stuff here, and when I say asks, it's probably more accurate to say he orders these things to be done. Um, at no point in time did the Secretary of the Navy or the President officially reprimand or correct Roosevelt. He was not removed from office. He was not fired. They didn't even say anything negative about it. Because by this point in time, McKinley knows that war is inevitable. The thing is that he just wants it on his terms. So, what actually caused the war? And it is really a confusing hodgepodge. So, the first thing to keep in mind is the sinking of the Maine itself. The fact that the Maine sunk is a huge issue. Um, and if it was the work of Spain, it's an obvious act of war. So, here's where the confusion comes in on this part. The initial U.S. Navy analysis of the sinking of the Maine concluded that it was most likely an accident caused by a malfunction on board the ship. A few days later, the Navy issues a retraction and says, no, we were wrong. Spain attacked us. It was some kind of super weapon or secret weapon we don't know about. This has led this sort of like backpedaling has led to the belief that the sinking of the Maine is what is referred to as, excuse me, oops, a false flag. I'm making the F look like a flag, so it's even more ingrained in your head. A false flag operation. Sorry, it's taking so long to write this. A false flag operation is when a country fakes an attack on itself to blame somebody else and start a war. Now, we have to be really careful and be very clear. There is no evidence that there actually was a false flag operation, but there is a trend for that. That's kind of how the Mexican War started. Um, it's how the Vietnam War starts 60 years after this. It's not uncommon for countries to engage in false flag operations. You attack yourself and you blame other countries for it as an excuse to start a war with another country. So that's the sinking of the Maine and its rather squirrely problematic nature. In March of 1898, so a month after the Maine explodes, a month after the great insult of the Duluth litter, there is a Senate visit to Cuba led by Vermont Senator Redfield Proctor. That's what VT is, Vermont. Proctor notices that in the month since the revolution has been officially declared over with the ceasefire and the concentration camps have been dissolved, the Cuban people are living in horrible subhuman conditions. And Proctor's conclusion is that the United States actually has a moral duty to declare war on Spain because of how awful the conditions are for the Cuban people. His report convinces American investors in Cuba, sugar plantation owners and bankers, that war is actually necessary and would be good for them to support. A month later, in April of 1898, things have gotten even worse. On April the 11th, President McKinley asks the Congress to prepare for hostilities. Translation, we're most likely going to go to war. In response, the U.S. Congress passes something known as the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment is a statement by the government that we are not interested in taking over Cuba. If we go to war with Spain over Cuba, it is for the purpose of freeing Cuba and setting up peace, not for conquering or taking over Cuba. A few days later, on April the 22nd, the United States Navy blockades Havana Harbor, preventing ships from entering or leaving. This blockade forces Spain to declare war on the United States, and the United States responds by declaring war on Spain. Okay, we'll pick this up tomorrow. Peace and love.